This is what obstruction of justice looks like. Two pieces of evidence that a federal judge has ordered to be made public could impact public opinion about the obstruction of justice investigation into Donald Trump. That investigation looked into Trump's efforts to thwart the Russia probe and ended with special counsel Robert Mueller saying he could not exonerate the president. Now, a federal judge has ordered the public release of some of the evidence that Robert Mueller contemplated when he wrote that he could not say the president hadn't committed crimes. That evidence includes a transcript of a phone call that stood in the center of the FBI's investigation into Michael Flynn, and a transcript of a call between the president's lawyer, John Dowd, and Flynn's lawyer. The Washington Post writes it up like this, quote, a federal judge on Thursday ordered that prosecutors make public a transcript of a phone call that former National Security Advisor Michael Flynn tried hard to hide with a lie. His conversation with the Russian ambassador in late 2016. U.S. District Judge Emmett G. Sullivan in Washington ordered the government also to provide a public transcript of a November 2017 voicemail involving Flynn. In that sensitive call, President Trump's attorney left a message for Flynn's attorney reminding him of the president's fondness for Flynn at a time when Flynn was considering cooperating with federal investigators. Together, those two pieces of evidence, which may even lead to the release of the actual audio tapes of those calls, could impact the public's understanding of the misconduct detailed in the dense 488-page Mueller report, which describes how the president's most senior national security advisor discussed deals with Russians that he would later lie about. Also, a call in which the president's lawyer is clearly probing whether Flynn had implicated the president and asked for a heads up if Flynn planned to do so. It's the kind of evidence that's behind the brazen, coordinated White House and DOJ strategy of stonewalling Congress. It's also the kind of evidence that may recast Attorney General William Barr's decision to exonerate Donald Trump as being at odds with Mueller's ultimate conclusions on obstruction if Mueller himself ever testifies. From last night's court filing, quote, the defendant, Mike Flynn, informed the government of multiple instances, both before and after his guilty plea, where either he or his attorneys received communications from persons connected to the administration or Congress that could have affected both his willingness to cooperate and the completeness of that cooperation. And that is where we start today with some of our favorite reporters and friends. Former U.S. Attorney Joyce Vance is here with us on set. Associated Press White House reporter Jonathan Lemire, Ashley Parker, White House reporter for the Washington Post at the table, and Nick Confessori, political reporter for the New York Times. Four overtired parents at the table. What could go wrong on a Friday? Joyce, we're going to start with you, though. This is two different pieces of evidence. Two pieces of evidence that are alluded to in the Mueller report. But now we might have the kind of evidence that could crack open the public's understanding of Donald Trump's misconduct around the question of whether or not and how he and his legal team sought to obstruct the Mueller probe. Please explain both pieces for us.
So this should help the public understand how dangerous and how devious Attorney General Barr's efforts to mischaracterize the Mueller report as essentially exonerating the president, although he didn't go quite that far, but how devious that mischaracterization was. Because now, as we learn more about some of the evidence that's detailed inside of the Mueller report, we see that there was this concerted effort by the president's personal lawyers to try to get Michael Flynn, someone who held powerful evidence about the president, tried to get Flynn not to cooperate with investigators. And we have to ask ourselves, as we see this story unfold, why was it so important to the president that Michael Flynn not cooperate with prosecutors? What is there still there that we don't know, or that's become public in the report that we don't quite have context for? So that's what we'll look for, is this story about the efforts to keep Flynn from cooperating by the president's team move forward.
And Joyce, it would seem to me that when the actual words of the president's lawyer are heard, and we have a transcript, I'm going to read it, but it makes the assessments given by people like Jim Comey that the Trump team reminded him of a mob family. If you hear it but don't see it, or if you hear it characterized but can't decide for yourself if these people sound more like a scene out of The Sopranos, you sort of have to take a he said, but let's let people decide. Here's what John Dowd said to Mike Flynn's lawyer. He said, this is a transcript that appears, a partial transcript of that voicemail that this judge has ordered released, the whole transcript by May 31st. Here's what the part of it that's in the Mueller report. This is John Dowd. If I could do a John Dowd voice, I would, but I'll spare everybody on a Friday. So he calls Flynn's lawyer and he says, it wouldn't surprise me if you've gone on to make a deal with the government. If there's information that implicates the president, then we've got a national security issue. So, you know, we need some kind of heads up, just for the sake of protecting all of our interests if we can. Remember what we've always said about the president and his feelings toward Flynn, and that still remains. Joyce, can we just take that apart? It wouldn't surprise me if you've gone on to make a deal with the government. He's saying, we understand you may be a cooperating witness. If there's information that implicates the president, then we've got a national security issue. What does that mean?
You know, when I heard this, I thought maybe it was actually an outtake from Godfather 1, because that's exactly what it sounds like, right? And it's important to remember that this is not government lawyers. This is the president's personal lawyer trying to keep a witness from cooperating with the government. So what business does he have invoking national security? That's not within his wheelhouse. So we know that that's actually not what this call is about. This is about the president's security, about Trump family security, and he's trying to appeal to Mike Flynn maybe in a way that he thinks will work. But they clearly know at this point that the game is just about over.
So let me bring this into focus as well. Remember what we've always said about the president and his feelings toward Flynn, and that still remains. What does that mean? What do feelings have to do with anything, Joyce?
I'd be proud to present that evidence to a jury as part of an obstruction case. First, there's this notion, remember what the president has always said. Does that mean that there were direct conversations between the president and Mike Flynn on multiple occasions? Did the president tell Flynn he would protect him, for instance, if he didn't testify? It's now incumbent upon us to find out what the answer to that question is. And so this evocation of the president has good feelings about you, you know, I think that we sometimes get hung up as lawyers on our need to prove facts beyond a reasonable doubt. But there is no way to read this other than the president saying, I feel good about you, I'll take care of you, maybe even I'll pardon you if you get into trouble, as long as you stay on my side of the line.
And Joyce, we know from reporting in the New York Times that a Trump lawyer raised the prospect of pardons for Flynn and Manafort. We know that that was something that Robert Mueller probed. It would appear that revelations like this and a judge ordering that this be made public also explains the DOJ White House strategy, but it doesn't explain what was behind Mueller's ultimate decision to leave this to Barr, except, of course, that maybe that wasn't Mueller's decision, that maybe leaving the obstruction probe unresolved was the end of the Mueller probe, no?
You know, it's such a difficult question. We don't know what was animating Bob Mueller's decision at that point in time. It seems like it would have been so easy for him to go a little bit further. And so at some point in time, we will have to hear Mueller and perhaps others from his team testify. It seems like it would be a good idea for Congress actually to put on a panel of people so we could hear views from the team as to how these decisions were made. But it's really difficult, I think, to explain to people who have not been prosecutors inside of DOJ, to explain how carefully we make these decisions, how hesitant we are to go too far, how strongly we try to protect legal norms. And in the era of Trump, where the White House is blowing away all of the legal norms that it can push through as quickly as it can, that seems antiquated and outdated. But it's part of this respect for the rule of law and this care we take with preserving the system that seems so quaint these days.
The other piece of evidence is of course, a transcript that will be made public at the end of May. of the call behind Flynn's original lie. It was a call between Mike Flynn and Russian Ambassador Sergei Kislyak, in which sanctions were one of the things discussed, and I believe a UN vote having to do with Israel was another. President Obama was still in office, and it was a call, not really extraordinary in too many regards. There's often context and questions, I guess, about whether or not it violated the Logan Act, but it was something that Flynn lied about. So do you think we'll learn why he lied?
I hope so. I mean, I think it goes back to this issue of, if collusion is a dead letter from a criminal conspiracy perspective, it's not from a political perspective or an impeachment perspective. And the more we understand, the more questions there really are. Why so many contacts with Russians? And why the drive to keep them secret, to lie about them, to hide from them? This from a president who has been screaming no collusion over and over again for 2 years. And yet they have had a scorched earth strategy to lie and deceive and cover up these contacts all along. And the question is why?
You just said the most interesting thing I've heard all week. So the collusion question as a criminal conspiracy is yes, it's asked and answered in Robert Mueller's perspective. But do you think that the collusion question is still an open political and geopolitical foreign policy question?
I think it is, because look, people have a right to evaluate all of these contacts and all of these decisions. It couldn't be a criminal conspiracy, perhaps, but it's still very strange and hinky, and people are right to inspect those contacts and decision points and working together with the Russians on different issues to evaluate if it was inappropriate and improper. The important thing is the line can't be that it's illegal, and if it's not illegal, it's great. Some things are terrible and still legal. And we've totally lost sight of this idea, and I think the Trump White House has really pushed it. If it's not illegal, it's totally awesome. We should all do it, and we have to be stupid not to do it.
So your baby isn't old enough for you to be a Lego Batman fan, but the theme song is Everything is Awesome. And that is the theme song of the White House counsel's office. Not only is stonewalling in our purview, not only are we protecting the executive, everything here is awesome. Everything is not awesome. Robert Mueller found, I think, more than 140 contacts between Trump and his associates and Russians. And I have this sense that the lawyers are over-responding in a way that looks so suspicious. They are emboldening and incentivizing an impeachment and investigation process.
Well, but what's so striking is, to the everything is awesome point, the White House and the president himself are pretty unabashed at publicly coming out and saying, frankly, wouldn't you have done this too? And the answer in a lot of instances is no. Another campaign, another candidate would absolutely not have done this. But the president often says this, and it is sort of messaging to his supporters. Wouldn't you have taken loopholes too if you could get your goods made cheaply in China? That was something that came out when it turned out his ties were getting made over there. Wouldn't you have found loopholes to pay no taxes if you could? That's just smart business. And so you're seeing
no, everyone doesn't make everything in China, and everyone does not cheat on their taxes.
That's absolutely correct. But again, what is so striking is that the White House will sort of, this isn't sort of a private line. I mean, this is a public thing that the president will say somewhat proudly. And you're right, it may embolden people to sort of go back and investigate. But it may cause some of his hardcore supporters to say, you know what, if the Russians came to me with Oppo on my opponent, I would have been silly not to consider it as well.
Let's just go one step further. Just last week, Rudy Giuliani, the president's attorney, was going to go to Ukraine to prompt investigation. Yeah, he was going. And a few hours later,
for Ukraine,
he was on the flight to Kiev. And then a few hours later, he stopped. And there were degrees of how inappropriate that was. And
but wait, why did he stop?
He stopped because there was pushback. There was pushback.
Because it's not normal.
Of course it's not. And some Republicans chimed in as well, which may have played a role as to why he didn't do it. But up until that point, he was justifying it, saying, like, well, why wouldn't we go? Why wouldn't we go? That's right. Why wouldn't we go mental investigation? Someone might say it's improper, but it's not illegal. So this is still something that's very much in this administration's playbook, is that if they can get away with it, they're going to try.
But I guess here's my larger point. Is it clear that they've gotten away with it? To Nick's point, they may have escaped the narrow criminal conspiracy question Robert Mueller was asking, but it's not clear that they've escaped impeachment.
It's true.
And the Justice Department had an expectation that there was a plausible scenario where impeachment proceedings would commence, and that would be the scenario in which they'd have to turn over underlying evidence and make witnesses.
Right. And I also think it's a good point that the fixation lately has been on the obstruction part of it. And obviously these phone calls, the Dowd phone call and the message, is an overlooked incident in the Mueller report. But the collusion question still still remains as a political animating force, too.
And foreign policy.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Other countries, not just Moscow, but other foreign capitals will look at this, too, and say, well, okay, there wasn't a criminal conspiracy, but this is still strange. Why was he always doing Putin's bidding? Why were people lying about every contact they had with the Russians? How is that influencing their foreign policy, and therefore how should we impact how we treat the United States and its allies? So I think that's part of it, too, is that even if the criminal danger has passed, that there's still a lot of political worry for this White House.
Joyce, it's also obvious that the Mueller question does not feel, from the perspective of the White House, like something that's been put to rest. The president was clearly triggered this morning, spewing away lunacy from his Twitter feed, and this specter of Robert Mueller simply testifying to the facts of the Mueller report, simply reading parts that haven't really been. I mean, this is in focus because a federal judge ordered the release of documents that are cited in the Mueller report. But we've now been talking about these documents for almost 24 hours. If every obstruction flashpoint were brought into focus like this for 24 hours, the political dynamic could change dramatically for this White House.
Well, it really could. And if we ever get to the point where there are witnesses testifying up on the House side and where documents are turned over so that Congress can begin to take a look at them, they could be very dangerous for the president, or at least how quickly he goes to the mattresses on Twitter suggests that. And that, I think, explains this White House's strategy of fighting every subpoena, fighting every effort for disclosure. We may not know exactly what the problems the president has are, but it seems very clear that whether they're financial problems, whether they're contact with Russia problems, that his administration and maybe, frankly, his practices over decades are so rife with corruption that they simply can't withstand the microscope of public scrutiny.
The president tweeted this morning that someone should have warned him about Mike Flynn. I think the list of people who did is longer than the list of people who didn't, which I only know of Jared Kushner, who didn't. This was the president's tweet. It now seems General Flynn was under investigation long before it was common knowledge. It would have been impossible for me to know this. But if that was the case, whatever, I'm not going to read the rest of it. Why wasn't I told? Chris Christie told him and basically lost his job as head of the transition. He writes about that in his book. President Obama told him. Joe Biden was in the office when that happened. I think plenty of people warned him about Mike Flynn. Sally Yates walked over and told Don McGahn. We can watch that again.
We felt like it was critical that we get this information to the White House in part because the vice president was unknowingly making false statements to the public, and because we believed that General Flynn was compromised with respect to the Russians.
So, I mean, General Flynn was like the bad boyfriend that, like, literally everybody warned him about. He dated him anyway. Which
is also what happens usually with the bad boyfriend.
Always, literally.
Attraction to the bad boyfriend. I mean, look, it's one of the many kind of mysteries of Trump is why was he so drawn to have this guy in his cabinet and give him so much power? And I've heard versions and theories about it that, look, they shared views on Islam and Muslims, and that was an animating idea for Trump.
I hail from the lunatic right. There are plenty other lunatics that share those views.
Who had that, and also he'd been rejected by Obama, which was actually a plus in Trump's mind. And just the fact that everybody was telling him not to do it. And we know from this president, he kind of likes zigging when everyone else is zagging. I don't know what the right answer is. I've heard all of those theories advanced.
There's also a new bit of information that Flynn was encouraged by people close to the president and Congress. Any theories on who in Congress was telling Flynn not to cooperate?
There are theories probably that it would be irresponsible to share with no reporting. But to me, that was actually one of the most intriguing lines in that report, because there's other stuff. But, you know, it was already in the Mueller report. We already knew about the phone call. But this was the first time, if I'm remembering correctly, you had any inclination that anyone on Capitol Hill was involved in that. And that, to me, is absolutely fascinating.
Well, it also connects a dot for me. Again, we don't know who it was, and it isn't revealed who it is. But it connects a dot. I mean, there is a multi-pronged effort from the president, and there was for the first 2 years in the Devin Nunes controlled that House Intel Committee. He declassified the FISA applications over the objections of the FBI. It also brings into question why on earth, we're going to talk about this more, but why is the Attorney General suggesting that there haven't been investigations about the origins of the Russia probe? Devin Nunes spent 2 years in collusion with the White House investigating and trying to really undermine the FBI and the original Russia investigation.
Sure, there have been a number of examples. Nunes is the best example, but even Chairman Burr at times had a
helping
hand to the White House to try to get them ahead of the game on these probes, to try to slow them down, at the most generous reading of that. And I think that is, these are questions that will hopefully be answered in the weeks to come. I mean, this is a story that's a lot of tentacles, is still sprawling, and you're right. I mean, the president's affection for Flynn is well known. I mean, the theories you have all floated are right, I think, but also that Flynn was there day after day on the campaign trail, was his attack dog, and let's remember, his constant traveling companion, and the president really sort of grew fond of him there. Let's also remember that Flynn was the one who led the first lock her up chant, which came at the Republican convention in Cleveland that summer.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me, or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.